Hey, aloha guys, coming at you with another YouTube video this week for archery and bow hunting stuff. Gonna try to get to these things weekly, so here goes. This topic is gonna be what the fuck. That is FOC, or front of center. Basically, it's a hot topic that's been going around social media and with archery and bow hunters in general, and there are whole companies devoted to selling you equipment and ideas and all kinds of builds for arrows to increase your front of center. We'll go over that today, so let's get started. All right, so what is front of center? Basically, I've got a bunch of my arrows here that I currently use between target and hunting. I actively use all of these arrows for everything, so I'm going to use those as kind of examples in this video. So to explain what front of center is in a quick way, basically if I took the overall length of the arrow and I found the midpoint of the arrow, say it's about here, right? And I were to go and find the center of mass, or the center or the balance point of the arrow, it'd be a little bit, forward of the arrow, because the point weight is a lot heavier, is heavier than the vanes and the nock in the back. So let's say that's somewhere about here, so to speak. So from here to the center of the arrow, which is about here, this distance, if you take that distance and you divide it by the overall length of the arrow, that'll give you your percent front of center. And basically a lot of arrow manufacturers and for bow hunting, they try to give you a standard rule of thumb of shooting a front of center between something over maybe 7% and all the way up to 15%, maybe more preferably 9 or 10% to 15%. And that's kind of what I see in the industry, and where I've competed in competition, and where a lot of people's arrow builds fall. Now, I said there are whole companies devoted to selling you front of center products and ways to increase your front of center on an arrow generally. It's been my personal experience. I think a lot of that is overrated, so to speak. Now, there are merits to what they're saying. I'll try to go over that today with each of my arrows and why that is. But for the most part, I do think it's overrated. And if you want to, look for other opinions on this idea, I would say maybe put a little more weight into some of the professional archers that happen to bow hunt as well. They do it for a living. That's how they, I mean, they have all the time in the world to really go over their setups and fine tune it. And I think you'll find that in their world, they don't do a whole lot of extreme front of center work or anything like that. They stay anywhere between that probably 9 to 15% range. Now, why is front of center such a big deal? I think in the bow hunting world, there's a notion that more front of center increases your penetration. I'll get into that following this. But the other thing is about arrow projectile flight, or maybe stable aerodynamics of a projectile in flight. Mechanical engineer here, try not to get too technical here, try to keep it simple. But basically, in a stable aerodynamic projectile, what you want to look for is what the center of pressure is and what the center of mass is, and the relationship of those two things. So I'll try to explain it here. So center of mass is where the arrow would balance, right? That's the center of all the mass of the projectile. So say it's here. The center of pressure is the sum of all the drag forces and where that lies along the arrow. So, when you shoot the arrow, there'll be a drag on the front. If you got a broadhead, there'll be more drag than just a typical point, right? You got blades sticking out, you got more cross-sectional area into the wind, and your vanes in the back, right? It's like, if you had a broadhead in the front, it creates drag. Well, the vanes sticking off the arrow creates drag forces as well, and what you want is the sum of all those drag forces across the arrow needs to line up somewhere behind the center of mass. So basically, as you shoot it in flight, the arrow will generally pivot around the center of mass, so to speak. It's not perfect, but that's the idea. So as long as the drag forces are behind it, as long as you're shooting it, if the forces pull on the back of the arrow and keep the back of the arrow in line with the front can't plane off. So that's the basic idea of a very stable aerodynamic arrow. And how people say when you increase the front of center, you're increasing the point weight, you're moving that center of mass forward, which is you're increasing the distance from the center of pressure where all the drag forces result. So that's one way to make a more stable arrow. The other way is, of course, you just increase the drag, put more vane in the back of the arrow. And I think what you see in the industry and with professional archers is they don't we don't try to make the point really heavy to stabilize an arrow. We'll more look at the drag with the vanes that we create with the arrow, and look at that more seriously. So when you look at indoor arrows that you're only shooting short distances and the arrow needs to stabilize in a short amount of distance, 20 yards or 18 meters per se, they put bigger vanes than this outdoor arrow that I have here. So the other thing we talked about was penetration, and how maybe increasing the front of center can increase your penetration. And I find this to be true in some of my hunting arrows, although I would say, I kind of said it's overrated. I would say that there's a happy medium in everything, you know, balancing accuracy and forgiveness in an arrow and penetration if you're hunting with it. So I would first say that I think a lot of the front of center hype is, you know, to get a lot of front of center. I'll grab my hunting arrow here. This is my hunting arrow. To get a lot of front of center, basically you're going to increase the point weight. Now you can do things to lighten up the back, and that definitely drastically affects that. But you know, a lot of people just go to the point weight first. And when you increase the point weight, basically you're increasing the overall mass of the arrow. And when you increase the overall mass of the arrow, you increase its momentum, meaning the inertia it has, or the ability for it to stay in motion once in motion. So, you know, if you think about it, it's like a ping pong ball versus a bowling ball. The bowling ball is going to want to continue to move through the target, or continue to move more than a ping pong ball just, you know, bouncing off a little twig or something like that. So increasing the mass, more point weight, definitely will increase penetration, but it also increases the front of center. So I think, you know, I wouldn't say don't mistake that going more front of center by increasing more point weight, increasing the overall weight of the arrow, that the penetration has increased simply because of the front of center. Now, there are some merits to that, in that, you know, if a lot of the mass is forward and you get a fairly stiff shaft, that, you know, when it hits the target, a stiffer shaft will be less inclined to bend and absorb energy as it passes through a target. So putting weight in the front, it can have some effect, though, you know. I don't think it's super drastic. I don't think it's gonna make or break. Say you had a 10% front of center arrow, and then you went to a 20% front of center arrow, that, you know, you wouldn't have killed that animal with the 10% now that you got 20%. You know, that's going to make a huge difference. I don't think so. For my experience, what I typically look for and what's most important in penetration is shot placement, 100%. You know, now there's exceptions if you want to hunt really big stuff, and I haven't hunted like elephant or Cape buffalo or anything like that. Biggest thing I hunted were elk and sheep and goats and deer that we have in Hawaii. So I would say, of course, I'd shoot a heavier arrow for elk than I might shoot for sheep and deer here. But I'd say shot placement is everything. If you want to go start shooting everything in hard bone structure, you're going to have penetration issues, especially if you're a short draw archer like me. So I would focus on the accuracy and making good shot placement and taking good angled shots, you know, kind of your bow hunter ethics. They're really, you know, going to, if I just make a 25% front and center arrow, I can shoot the animal anywhere. And I don't think that's entirely true. Especially if you're a light draw archer or a short draw archer like myself, a 26.5-inch draw, I could make a light arrow with a ton of front and center. But what I explained about momentums, you know, you could have a lot of front and center, it hits, but the arrow is so light that it wants to cock in any direction after it hits the target, that, you know, you lose a lot of penetration when that arrow does not enter straight and continue on straight with good inertia and good momentum. If it just cocks a little bit or deflects because of your blade hitting a bone or something like that, a light arrow will just lose all of its energy. So a little bit of front and center can help, but I don't think it's going to make or break your setup. All right, now that I said shot placement is the most important thing, that's synonymous or related to accuracy or long range precision. Now, it has definitely been my experience with long range shooting that front and center does help. I'm not going to say extreme front and center because I have experimented with that, and I'll use my hunting arrow as an example. This is a Eastern Axis 340 spine arrow. It's 150 grains up front. It's a 50 grain brass, 100 grain point, and then the 5 grain broadhead collar. And it's got flex fletch 360 vanes and the typical X knock on it. But basically it's 440 grains. And I have tested this quite extensively at longer ranges, so between 50 to 100 yards. It's been my experience that I can shoot a 100 grain, that's typical standard insert, which might be about 17 or 18 grains and 100 grain point, so giving you about 120 something, 120 grains up front, with the collar. And it doesn't, I'm talking far, it doesn't, it just hasn't grouped as well for me at those 60 plus to 100 yards like 155 grains has up front. Now, I'm not going to say that it's purely because of the point weight, because my outdoor long range arrows that I use at Reading or kind of field target competition, not the same concept. That's a 120 grain point, and that one shoots amazingly well. But relative comparing, if I generally spine this right and I put a lighter point up front, I just don't see the same kind of consistency downrange to my mistakes or forgiveness, so to speak. What I'm saying is, I think the general principle is this. Now, I don't have slow motion photography to validate my claim, but the results downrange speak for itself. So what I would say is just make a setup that has different point weights, different front and center, and shoot them all and see what works for you and find out what's most accurate. But this has been my experience. So properly spine arrow, I can put standard insert and I shoot, and I can get the same groups, at 100 yards. I mean, super tight ones too sometimes, they're kind of 4 or 5 inch group way out there. But I feel like when I make little mistakes on the back end, or I just don't make as strong a shot, that lighter point weight, it's just easier to veer off track, or say it's a slightly windier day or something like that, veer off track, and it just kind of opens up the groups. Versus when I had a little more point weight, like 155 is what I got in my current hunting setup total. I feel like my bad shots just don't miss by as far, if that kind of makes sense. And what all I'm explaining is this would be more useful for a more proficient archer that can tell the difference between his setups and is very consistent in his shooting. But if your shooting is lagging and not all there, quite honestly, it doesn't matter what arrow I give you, you might shoot them all equally junk. So, you're gonna want to shore up your proficiency in your shooting, maybe more so than your equipment. And that's something else I can talk about, that balance between, what do you spend on? Do you spend on yourself more, or do you spend on the equipment more? And I would say first, make sure your skills are where you want to be before you even, spend fortunes on your equipment. But archery is a consumer market, and people always want to find the easy way out, and there's no free lunch in archery. All right, so there's a lot of things that we can talk about with this, to the nitty gritty, from high level to super deep, and there's no way I'd cover it all in a video that you guys could watch. So I think one of the best ways to go over it is I'll just go over each one of my arrows and kind of what I've experienced in the context of front and center, and hopefully maybe that's experience that might help you out in making the setups that you might want to look at or maybe test out for yourself. All right, so the first arrow I'm going to talk about is my outdoor target arrow. Currently it's a Easton Carbon 1 500 spine. Got little 2-inch AAE veins on the back and 120 grain point. The front and center on this arrow, and I went and measured it, so let me take a look real quick. This is 14.5%. On this arrow, it's 25 inches long. Like I said, I got a short draw. It's around 320 grains total arrow weight. And I tested point. I didn't say I was looking for a specific front and center. I would say most of my front of center setups for arrows, long range shooting or even my hunting, will fall anywhere between that 9 to 15% range. And I think you'll find, if you look at a lot of the professional setups, that they'll probably fall around the same area. They're not shooting crazy amount of point weight to get crazy front and center. So. But I do look at it from a point weight perspective. It's a glue-in point, it's 125 grain point, but it breaks off to 100 grains. And I've shot this. This is and tested it too. I've shot this at Reading. I've only been to Reading once, but those standardized competitions are good ways to tell of someone's proficiency, I would say. So it was my first time there. I got a 1522 out of 1540, so I think that's a pretty good score for my first time there, and hopefully we're gonna step it up, and I've got goals to maybe hopefully make the shoot off sometime in the professional ranks. But I'm not a professional, just a high level amateur. But I did test the arrow, and I shot 100 grain points out to 100 yards because the furthest target there is 101 yards. And my 100 grain point, like I explained with the hunting arrow, just seemed a little touchy, like it wasn't as forgiving. So when I would shoot the 120 grain, it felt like I could make a few mistakes and it'll hit. Now, they do make tungsten 140 grain points for this. I did not try that because they're very expensive. But actually, no, maybe they don't make them for this because those are for the more expensive Easton X10 arrows. And yeah, this is a cheaper carbon one. Someday I'll step up to those AC arrows. But yeah, I can tell you the 120 grain point, heavier point weight, better out at long distance. I can say a lot of the professionals that I were around at the time, I believe they're shooting anywhere between 100 to 140 grains, and a lot of them probably at 120 grain is pretty popular weight. So, and shooting 100 yards, shooting amazing, phenomenal with those things, and you get to watch them. So you don't need crazy point weight to get that kind of accuracy at long range. And all right, next one, onto my hunting arrow. Easton Axis 340, 5mm, 155 point weight in the front, and check out the veins on the back. Just love this arrow. It's been working out really good. 440 grains total weight. I'm 26.5-inch draw, 70-pound bow. Basically, my hunting setup, I wasn't looking for front and center. I just picked the point weight, shot them all at distance, found which one was most accurate for me. I place accuracy a bit ahead of the arrow weight, so to speak, but I do want a slightly heavier arrow. This total arrow weight is 440 grains, and it shoots I'm gonna have to guess at about mid 260 feet per second or something like that. So not very fast, but not very slow. In the past, I have shot 500, 515 grain arrows that went low 240 feet per second, and I gotta admit, the spot and stock game where I have the proficiency to shoot 50, 60, 70, 80 yards when the pin gaps are so far apart because my arrow velocity is so slow. It becomes very critical to know the range out there, and a little bit of speed does help. Sometimes I don't need that much momentum or arrow weight to penetrate the target, the animal that I'm trying to kill out there. So I would say, if you want to optimize setups or things like that, especially in Hawaii, we have small animals. Our sheep and goats are small. Even Axis deer is about the biggest target I shoot at here locally, and even that's not really, really big. It's not an elk or anything like that, or a big mule deer. So yeah, accuracy and getting that, tighter pin gap and not have to be so critical on the range matters. Again, though, mid 260s, short draw. I'm not gonna go fast anytime soon, but and it's not a tight pin gap at all. It's still quite critical, so to speak. But for me, that's the balance that I came up with for my hunting setup. Oh, and I forgot. The front and center of this arrow is 14.2 grains, so 14.2% measured on this one. So still within that 9 to 15% range. All right, next one is my traditional archery hunting arrow. It's a gold tip, traditional, 55-75. I guess they call these the 400 spines today. It's an old shaft, but it's a 540 grains. It has 250 grains of point weight in the front, and it's almost about 28.5-inch arrow. The front and center on this is 20.8%. Wow, it kind of breaks away from that 9 to 15% I was talking about, but I'm gonna explain it here in a little bit. It's got a 100 grain brass insert in it and a 150 grain point weight, and the arrow is fairly long and all of that. So with traditional archery, the traditional bows can't take that 5, 6, 7, 8 grains per pound kind of arrow. It may break the limbs. It's probably against the manufacturer's recommendation. So with my traditional arrows, I shoot for about 10 grains per pound of draw weight for my traditional hunting arrows. My bow is 55 pounds at my draw length, and this arrow is 540 grains. So right around there, that heavier mass weight in the arrow, and the recurve just doesn't have the same kind of stored energy and release of energy like a compound. That heavier weight gives it a little bit more momentum, and I get a lot of pass throughs with this arrow, even at my tiny draw. And actually I would say the same as my almost my compound actually. I mean, quite significant and impressive at sometimes. But yeah, you could say the FOC is higher in this one, but I would also say my arrow is a lot heavier, 440 grain compound arrow versus 540 grains. So can I say the extreme FOC is the thing that's giving the penetration? I don't know, not entirely, because the arrow is very heavy too. But part of that reason is, you know, the arrow is very long. With traditional archery, we have to kind of spine the arrow and tune the arrow to the bow because we don't really have bow adjustments. And if you don't do that, when you screw on a broadhead from your field point, you'll get left or right depending if it's stiff or soft, and it's just going to be a pain in the butt. So if you've never really tuned the traditional arrow, you're not going to understand what I'm really talking about there. But that's the reason why it's a little long. I needed a softer arrow to tune to my bow and my draw length. And a lot more point weight helps to give it the weight so that I'm not shooting too light of an arrow for the bow, but also more point weight will break down the spine of the arrow, right? Increases the inertia of the front of the arrow. When the bow pushes on the back end, it bends more. So breaking down the spine of the arrow for my traditional, so that's the reason behind it. All right, next arrow here is my 3D unmarked yardage target arrow. And when I say 3D unmarked, basically what that is we're shooting 3Ds, but we're not allowed to use a rangefinder. We have to guess the range and shoot it. I don't do a whole lot of that here. There's maybe only one tournament a year for that. But I did make an arrow for it because my draw is so short that if I just shot my typical arrows, it'll lob in there and I'm going to be struggling guessing the yardage with such a slow arrow, and I'll be missing highs and lows all day, and it would just be embarrassing compared to the competition. So I made a very light arrow because what I'm looking for is speed in this aspect, and a very light arrow generally means probably a light point weight. So there's only a 90 grain point in this. It's a Easton Super Drive 23 arrow, the 475 spine, AE max vanes on the back, and the FOC on this arrow is 8.2%. So I think manufacturers say get at least above 7%. So this is 8.2% on the ragged edge. But I will say, you know, not a whole lot of windy day. And in unmarked 3D, we're only shooting up to 50 yards. And I could say that, you know, the average bow hunter, you know, kill zones and stuff like that, probably 50 yards is quite far probably for the average bow hunter ethically. So, you know, maybe you don't need to look at all those long range stuff that I was talking about earlier. But 90 grain point, 8.2%, and at 50 yards, this thing groups. It'll group it'll group in a little 12 ring if I do my job at the max range that I'm going to shoot. So, it's a tailored arrow to the situation. Would I shoot this arrow at, you know, 80 and 100 yards? Would I take this to Reading? Absolutely not. It's going to be atrocious. Just a little bit of wind is going to blow this really light arrow off. It's not a whole lot of point weight in it. It's very easy to steer off. But again, it's designed for 50 yards and under. Unmarked 3D, where speed is more important to me, I'll likely be off in range estimation than I will be in anything else. So, you know, if I can minimize those errors on my range estimation by shooting a faster arrow, that's the game. But what I would say is, again, it's only 50 yards. Most bow hunters, average bow hunter proficiency might only be that far. So, you know, do you really need crazy FOC to shoot that far? You make your choice, but if it was me, I don't think so. I would strive for a decent arrow weight to take the game that you're looking for, but also, you know, to get a good pin gap so you don't have to be so perfect on your yardage estimation, especially if you're spotting stalking on the ground and, you know, the ranges are very dynamic, the situation is very dynamic, and you may not have time to always pop up your rangefinder and get a range. All right, moving on, second to the last arrow. It's my indoor target arrows. This is a Easton X23 2312 indoor target arrow. It's an aluminum arrow. I love aluminums. As a diehard aluminum fan for hunting. And, you know, if the carbons weren't made any better, I shot aluminums all the way up into probably 2011. I just couldn't get away from them, but carbons today are really good. So my indoor target arrow, love this arrow. It has a 150 grain point, and the front and center on this one is 12%. So we're in that 9 to 15% range. With indoor archery, we're only shooting 20 yards or 18 meters, so I don't need to consider long range accuracy. Basically, what is most important at indoor archery is high grade of precision. With, you know, it's a fatter arrow, so you can cut a few lines on the target, but you're just looking for utmost precision because you need to make perfect shots in that game. You go to I've competed at Vegas last year. Was my first time. I got an 894 in the pro class. We were all supposed to shoot 900s, but I can shoot 900s at home all day. It's just on that floor, it's really tough. But this is the arrow I used, 894. I guess that's okay for my first time there. Bit of nerves, wasn't so seasoned, but I think I'll get better and maybe one day make the shoot off. But yeah, I've tested a lot with this arrow. I've shot I think 175 grain points, 200 grain point even, and the 150. Quite honest, the 150 shot as good as the others, and I didn't see any change versus shooting the others. So I'm gonna be quite honest. I picked a lighter point weight just because I thought maybe if I get this arrow off my hands and faster to the target, I could create less error. You know, it wouldn't be so critical to my errors, and it's been working out okay. So yeah, that's that. I used to do, you know, my college rifle days. I actually used to shoot two different types of ammo. Speaking of velocity, and I would shoot in practice a slower ammo, and that ammo was. I even shot a slower ammo for kneeling and prone 3-position rifle as well, because it was the most accurate one. But when I would get to offhand, I noticed that the faster the round was, I felt like I could get away with poor shots because it would get out of the gun quicker. So I did shoot a different ammo, a little bit higher velocity ammo for my offhand stages, even though it wasn't maybe the most precise one, because I felt like when I shot the slower stuff, I got penalized sometimes. You know, you're in the middle and you just execute a little off, that little movement, it would go there instead of be quick out of the barrel and into the target and into the 10 faster. So it's my indoor arrow. Okay, last arrow is another indoor arrow. It's a Black Eagle PS26. It's a bit fatter, fatter shaft than my Super Drive 23 that I really like. I don't use this one so much, but it has been one that I used in the past. It's got a 200 grain point. It's about 29 inches long, and the front and center on this is 16%. Generally, you know, as the arrow gets longer, it can get a little more difficult to get front and center unless you add a lot of point weight, you know, just because of the weight in the back is even further from the center of the arrow as well. So 200 grain point weight, I've shot all kinds of point weight with it. And again, like I said, test it all and see what's more accurate for you or what fits your needs, and, you know, go with that. But yeah, the same thing. If I shoot too light a point on this, it feels very critical. Like if I make a bad shot on the back, I feel like it goes further out than it should. So yeah, set it on a 200 grain point. I can talk about indoor arrows, I guess, someday with my testing. But I just find the smaller diameter 23 arrow is a bit more forgiving than these 26s. I don't know exactly why. Maybe it could be the spine, a very stiff arrow being, you know, so sensitive on the back end because the shaft is so stiff that there's no give. But I don't know. It's just what I find and just what I've tested. And, you know, quite honestly, it's how's it perform downrange. That's all that matters. Everything else we can break down to the gnat's eyebrow. You know, FOCs, percents, numbers, grains, all this stuff. But at the end of the day, it's how does it shoot and does it work? So really experiment with all this stuff. Hopefully you got some of my experience with FOC. Again, guys, I'm going to try to do these things weekly. Pick a topic or something like that and go over it. So, you know, if you want to stay up to date, hit the subscribe button and maybe the like button too. Help me get some more views so I can try to grow this channel. But with that, hopefully that's useful. Aloha, guys. We got a incoming Hurricane Douglas right now. So I'm going to try to get this out hopefully before a hurricane comes and maybe we don't lose any communications or something like that. But anyway, stay safe. Aloha, guys. Take care.